Can I start? Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this third in our monthly seminar series, TCIPG series on technologies for building a resilient power grid. This is a particularly special seminar this month because it's if you will, the highlights or the key takeaways of a day-long seminar that's going on here hosted by NIST. And so we're really pleased that we have people from the NIST working group here to tell us about the Neustar with respect to cybersecurity. So we have three special guests. We have Bill Hunteman, we have Ellen Greenberg, who are both vice chairs of the working group, NIST working group on cybersecurity, and we have Mark Enstrom, who is the secretary of that working group. Alan is from Boeing, Bill is from Department of Energy, and Mark is from Neustar Incorporated. And what we're doing today, for those of you who just joined us, is walking through in depth the NIST cybersecurity document. And we have quite a big audience here, I think 60 or 70 people, maybe more in the room. And for those of you who just joined us, I know we have a bunch of people out via the WebEx as well. So a couple of things before we get started. If you'd like to ask questions and you're in the room, please go to a mic. That will ensure the people who are listening remotely can hear us. If you're remote and you'd like to ask questions, use the raise hand tool in WebEx. So you have to be logged into the interactive of the two options. And once you raise your hand, then Michael, who's the operator from the room here, will give you control and you'll be able to speak and ask your questions. So this all works pretty seamlessly now. I think we've got it working well as we move forward in the seminar. So it's really my great pleasure to welcome all three of our speakers here, and the first one will be Alan, who will kick off this NIST and the smart grid in insider's look. So thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. For all of those who are not here in Illinois, I'm supposed to let you know that it is actually 80 degrees here, and everyone's running around in shorts and just drinking Mai Tais. I was supposed to tell you that to make you feel really jealous about not being at the University of Illinois for this seminar. Did I say that well, Bill?
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's always sunshiny at University of Illinois is what they tell me, or this. What I'm going to do for the people online is I'm going to go ahead through and catch you up a little bit about what we've been talking about. We've been talking about what is the NIST 7628, which is the guidelines for smart grid security. Talk to you a little about what it is, how the coordination came about for those folks in the room. I ask your indulgence a little bit as we do the catch-up. And then we're going to talk about two of the critical sections within the Neustar. The first one is on architecture, and the second one is on privacy. Those are the two sections we get the most discussion on as we go through. And it's proven to be some very entertaining discussions across the board, because there are a lot of people who are very concerned about how do we sit back and architect this system, not just from a security point of view, but also from a smart grid point of view, and then be able to build the security in. And the second part of the privacy concerns, because the amount of information flowing with smart grid changes a lot of what we think about privacy and how do we deal with the issues of privacy. So what is the NIST? It's an interagency report, was published in August 2010. It was the work of over 400 people from public sector, private sector, as well as academia. It was a development led by NIST. I'm not going to go into the background about how the NIST working group was formed, but it was a significant coordination across the board, and it's a document that's being used in selecting and modifying different security requirements, as well as building regulations and laws and governing information. Now, what is it? It's a tool. This is not meant to be a prescriptive item. It's meant to be a guideline. It is not meant to say thou shalt. There are other organizations that have legal and regulatory authorities that will sit back and be able to go forward and do the thou shalts. It's a guideline to help evaluate cyber risks so that people understand what things you have to do, and a guideline for organizations. Now, what it's not is, it's not a prescriptive document. It's not a thou shalt use a firewall or thou shalt use a company's technology. That was a very too much prescriptive to be able to do this, and it's not mandatory. It's meant to be a guideline, again, across the board. Now, as part of this, as part of the cybersecurity task, for the folks in the room, we talked about this earlier, we identified what were the things that we needed to do for a strategy. Everything from use case analysis, top-down analysis to identify risks, do the risk analysis from an unclassified view. There are many agencies in the government today that do the classified piece, but how do we share certain vulnerabilities across the board for an unclassified area? What are some of the impacts of those threats? Some bottom-up analysis, privacy assessments, high-level security requirements, security architecture, looking at different standards, how do those standards, other organization standards fit in, as well as conformity assessments. So our content is broken down into different sections. It's actually 3 different groups, and the Neustar includes an executive summary. For those folks who have never looked at smart grid and what is cybersecurity smart grid, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it is a very good guideline about what things to look at for understanding what is smart grid security. We have one about a security strategy, Chapter 1. Chapter 2, the logical architecture and interfaces we're going to talk about. Chapter 3 was the high-level security requirements. Chapter 4, cryptography and key management. Chapter 5 was privacy, which we'll talk about a little later. Chapter 6, the vulnerability classes. Chapter 7, the bottoms-up analysis. Chapter 8 was the research development themes. It was one we had talked about in the room a little earlier. Chapter 9 was about the standards review, what to take in place. And then Chapter 10 is about key power system use cases, because one of the things that helps people in being able to understand what to do with smart grid, especially the cybersecurity, is walk me through a use case. Walk me through a day in the life of an operator. And then we have various appendices with the Neustar. Now, as part of that roadmap activities, some of the things that we've done, we did a lot of face-to-face meetings. We had technical working sessions. We provided a lot of material out. We planned out a lot of activities. We've also coordinated with other federal agencies across the board, because that was a critical element of this. It could not be one organization doing this. We really had to bring everyone together, as well as coordinating across industry and academia. We do have proposed timeline. I'm not going to delve into this because this is being updated. We're building another 3-year roadmap. For those online and in the room, if you'd like to contribute to this, of things you see need us to do for the next 3 years. We had talked earlier about assessing overlapping standards, overlapping regulations. Please let us know if there are other things that you want us to focus in on over the next 3 years, so we can include those in. And then we're also updating the deliverable piece of other things that we'll do. For example, we published a guideline about understanding the NIST guide, if you will, the how-to book, how to use the Neustar. We're also looking at doing things with the different PAPs, the working groups, to sit back and put in implementation guides with those. But if there are other deliverables that you think we need to do, please let us know. One of the discussions we had at lunch was talking about the critical importance of education. And how do we now start wrapping in education? And it is an education not just of the cyber professionals, but an education for the non-cyber professionals. Because one of the challenges is, if you have someone who's run a communication system or runs a power plant, they can spell cyber. That may be as far as they go for depth. So you want to be able to teach them about what is cyber, what's a firewall, what's malware, what does it mean to me in my environment for being able to do different things when I sit back and design my system or I'm running my power plant? Or if I'm talking about distribution to people, what impacts cyber might have across the board. So those are important parts that we're adding to the deliverable pieces to make sure that we do the right things. Additionally, looking at, on the education piece, looking at having industry help us in understanding the job market implications of change of scope for people working jobs. Someone's a generator repairman. Well, now that person goes out and now has to replace not just the hardware on a transformer, now they have to sit back and change the software for most industry, that's a change of job codes. That has some implications if there's a union and their classification as well as their pay. So we need industry to help us in being able to understand the implications of when we go to re-educate the workforce, how do we sit back and make sure we cover all the right things and don't leave holes involved. Now, some activities that we're doing a lot of outreach and education. Today's session is an outreach. We're trying to go across all the regions of the country to talk about what is the NIST, what is the NISTer, and what it's not. Also to get feedback, and that feedback helps us because we take that back to NIST. We take that back to DOE. For example, Bill Hunteman from DOE is here to hear your questions. We also take that back to other federal agencies if they apply to those areas, whether it's DHS, Commerce, etc., to be able to give them feedback of, here's concerns that people have. Here's issues that they have. You need to consider this. It's not part of the cyber working group activities, but you need to think about these types of things. Additionally, to go ahead and coordinate, we do coordination with other agencies. We're working on a lot of implementation guides we talked about, and then we're working on some conformity assessment strategies. And then overall, working to address both the domain-specific and common risks. So let me shift a little bit to the architecture group. I'm sorry for those online for popping questions. I know how much fun that is when the WebEx shifts back and forth. So what we're going to talk about is the architecture that we came up with. And the architecture is at a high level, and it's a logical architecture, not an implementation architecture. Well, huge difference. There was a very deliberate decision to make it a logical architecture. The implementation crossed too many lines of being very specific. And there were issues of, do I use this company's technology or this company's technique when it got into the specifics? So we're trying to provide a guideline, and that lent itself to the architecture, to the logical architecture view. Now, the goals were to create a logical reference model that addressed the high-level requirements, again, not prescriptive, and then outside of the scope of this group was to specify solutions or technologies. We really wanted to stay away from that. We want to leave the innovation in there, and one of the other critical elements is the flexibility. There's a huge difference in the solution set between a, if you will, a Southern Cal Edison or a BGE, which has tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people out there, versus a farmer's co-op that has 2 turbines and 35 people. The security solution that you use is very different between the two. The logical base is still there, the fundamentals are the same, but how you're going to apply that is very different, because you do not want to apply a high-level solution to a small group that may not have that requirement. And again, as I'm going along, for the folks online and in the room, if you have questions, please ask them as we go. In the room, you all have not been shy, which is a good thing, for being able to go through this. So we developed a logical interface with logical diagrams. We broke that down into 7 domains. The providers, the customer, transmission, distribution, bulk generation, markets, and operations. And it was based upon the logical reference model that we used. Now, the diagrams went to detail for 22 logical interfaces. When we initially started this, there were I think over 200, I believe, Mark, for the initial set. Recognizing that was way too much and way too much information, trying to narrow it down to 22 key interfaces that needed to be there. And the key attributes, defining each of those, looking at the logical interfaces, especially security related, and then developing diagrams for the interactions, for things like the advanced metering, distribution grid management, electrical storage, electrical transportation, demand response, and the wide area situational network awareness. Now, this is perfectly simple. You can all read it and understand it well. And for everyone online, yes, they're beautiful colors that are here and exist. But it's broken down into what are the elements within each of the different areas. So, for example, on the customer side, you have everything from metering, energy services, energy management systems, customer displays, customer appliances, customer generation and storage, water gas metering, electrical vehicle, submeter, and of course the customer itself, because part of that is also educating the customer to understand better now all the technology they have and how to use the technology. You know, one of my daughter's favorite sayings is when she gets new gadgets that she uses, whether it's anything from the super advanced iPhone, you know, to other everything from her watch. She now has a watch interface to the internet, which is, I think, really cool. But as she looks at me sometimes and goes, "Dad, you're so digital," and so you're so dial-up, is what she tells me. Which is, for those of us who are under 30, that's what you used to do to connect to the internet. So for a lot of people, how do you educate them how to use the technology? Because it's not enough just to give them the materials. If they don't know how to use it, then you really haven't given them a tool that they can be able to use and effectively work with. We also looked at service providers. What do they need? To include things like if you're doing a third party. One of the issues we found across many states is information is not controlled by the user, the customer, and it's not controlled by the government. There's a third party managing that. So as we go through the interfaces, that's something that has to be taken in account of how do you bring that to bear, and then how do you do the cybersecurity piece for that as well. For different operational pieces, from distribution to metering we've talked about, the operations internal, the operators, all those who interface with that, the work management system, how do you deal with outages from a cybersecurity point of view. We also looked at distribution to include the geographic impacts. We looked at the transmission side, the bulk generation side, the marketing side, for how do you do the marketing, how do you do cost-effective pieces with smart grid. So if you're going to put something in a home, or you're going to go ahead and add technology to the smart grid market, how do you do it in a cost-effective manner? We were talking here earlier about the joys of when the electrical company raises your rates by 10 cents a day or 10 cents a month. The initial reaction is, get the pitchforks, get the torches, let's go find the people who did this to us. How do you cost-effectively introduce new technologies to there? Now, if the last one was really clear, this one gets to be even better. This is one of our versions of what we call the spaghetti diagram. Yes, sir. Okay, go ahead. Can you time in? Okay. Can you go to the mic and read it off? Okay, we have a question online, so.
I'll ask again.
Or if you could type in the answer and you can read it off.
He's typing it.
Okay. I would tap dance or tell jokes, but you throw rocks at me.
What is the significance of the border around the actors?
Back up a second. Oh, the squigglies? The squigglies are here to break out into the different sections. So, for example, the question was, what is the significance of the borders around it? These were the areas, for example, in the customer section that we saw for the different things that need to be decided, whether it was 1 through 11 in the customer section, or the distribution section, which had different areas. And the numbering is all the different interface pieces, the logical interfaces we had. And for those online, if you didn't hear, the domains also line up with the SGIP conceptual model that was done. Okay, does that answer your question, sir? Just a second. Mike's headed back to the computer to verify. Some are being worked, and some are finalized. Okay. Moving on to then, as we start to connect up the dots about the interfaces between each of the different elements, as you can tell, it's very clear and very simple and not very hard to read. You can tell by each line that anyone can pick this up and fully understand it. And I'm saying all this tongue-in-cheek because it became very complex very quickly, which is why the 200-plus logical interfaces model did not work very well, because it just became way too much information. But we found connections in so many different places across the board between each of the different areas, whether it was something simple as billing, going back to metering systems, to AMI, back to the customer appliances, back to the internet connectivity. So all of those different interfaces tying back together and trying to identify them as best we could across the board. And we have still more work to do because there's more logical interfaces to work on. And additionally, again, this only covers the logical interfaces. That doesn't cover the implementation guides. So one of the other parts that the Smart Grid Working Group is trying to do is how do we start building the implementation guides that go with these? And that's one of our goals for the next set of 3 years, to be able to do that. Hopefully quicker than 3 years, but there's a lot of interfaces that we have to go through. Now, we've talked about each of the different diagrams. We tried to cover across the board the category with the relevant actors, the definitions and examples. How do you deal with confidentiality, integrity, and availability? How does that tie back to the applicable security requirements? And then we try to color code it to make it, and again, I'll say this lightly, as simple as we could, given the complex nature of this. Now, some examples with that of using this, when you're sitting back and taking a look at a simple category of how does this tie into high-level requirements, for things such as billing, where it goes back between the metering data system, you have a third party involved that is getting data. How do you deal with the retail energy provider and the metering feedback system that goes with that? What does that do to the distribution system, the distribution management system, and the operations of the system? All of those are intertwined as you go through. And so trying to look at what things do we need to do for the confidentiality, the integrity, authentication, as well as looking, and I think they can see the WebEx. Is that right, Mike? Yes. Okay. Looking at the different security requirements, we found 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 different security requirement areas that just a simple billing piece applies to. Everything from session, permitted actions, user identification, security isolation, denial of service protection, boundary protection, integrity, software protection, confidentiality of information. All of those come into play with just a logical interface, and also map back to the different high-level security requirements that are there. So again, we talked about each of the different pieces. One of the areas that we've talked about in the room was the interface between the billing system, the management, the office systems, back to the management authority that's running the electrical system. Not supposed to be there. A lot of systems found out, yeah, there is a backdoor in there. Something that they're trying to fix. Additionally, under Smart Grid, you may now want to have an exchange of information. So how do you deal with that in a secure manner? And that was one of the things the logical interface tried to do, is make sure you address this. Whatever methodology you're going to use, whether it's one way or you're going to put in a device or other software, hardware technology to allow that communication, that you actually consider that as you go through. And then how do you deal with a third party to be able to work that as well? You do not want in Smart Grid having the same kind of challenges that you have today with third-party credit card billing, where people are trying to break into that third party and get personal data. So you want to build in the protections up front to be able to provide the privacy and the protections that you need. Now, the actor color code, we've kind of gone over this, but just a little bit bigger picture. Transmissions, the bulk generation, marketing operations, service provider, distribution, and customer. Each of those, again, color-coded, so, again, saying it lightly, so we can understand, and simplify this as much as we could. We also included, like I said, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We looked at different ways of what happens with unauthorized disclosure. I will say we had some real challenges with this. A great deal of the industry people were used to the if you will, the DoD side or the high-end federal government side, where disclosures of information are traditionally classified information. It's a little bit different mindset when you're looking at privacy information and control information, and what would that impact be? So we looked at low impacts that have limited adverse actions, the moderate serious actions, and then high severe could have catastrophic operational impacts. We also found that there were some unique technical requirements along the way. We've talked a little bit about this, of trying to identify those that are unique to that application. And then starting to look at, again, the logical interfaces between each of these and laying out what happens with this. Let's kind of walk through one of these. Interfacing between the systems that use an AMI, between the metering management system and meters, and then the load management system as a demand response, and the customer energy system. There are a lot of issues we identified up front. The customer information has to be treated as confidential. Integrity of the data is important, and availability impact is generally low across the AMI networks. It's going to get there, but that's not as critical as you go through. And we identified the different links that come into play with the interfaces between the load management system, customer information, the AMI hardening, etc., the customer, the third party, because we had to include that as part of this scenario. We also identified some unique security requirements for what actions are allowed, what things happen with identification and authentication, communications integrity, etc., so that each of the different requirements blended back into the logical interfaces. Now, we also found that, again, confidentiality had to be high, integrity high, but the availability did not need to be as high. For logical interface category 18, between the metering equipment, we found that there were interfaces between the field crew tools, say that 3 times fast, and meters, between the sub-meter to meter, customers, and the meters as well. We found some issues as we went through the logical interfaces of the integrity of the revenue grading meter data was really high, and that had to be there. The availability had to be there. Key management for millions of meters. This is one we talked a little bit about briefly this morning, was about how do you sit back and deal with the management of this data. If you go with something simple as a PKI, even if it's just a signature piece, when you have 600,000 users, how do you deal with updates? And how do you have a system that's able to complete with that and then make it user invisible and user friendly? And many people, as you know, if you work with PKI, user friendly frequently does not enter into the conversation. It's one of those that you have to be able to do. And there's a lot of different stakeholders now involved with this, with the metering equipment. So you ended up with a lot of different pieces of water and gas meters, generation and storage pieces. You have electrical vehicles, and they plug in with this, because then your electrical vehicle is also going to be tied to this in terms of a metering capability. Customer appliances are tied in now. The energy management system, if you have a home energy management system, the wireless going off, the metering back in the billing office, in the back office, the energy provider, and billing itself. And we found a lot of different security requirements from, again, permitted actions, user identification, security function isolation, boundary protection, communications confidentiality, software and information integrity, and little things that popped up. We talked about education of that metering team that's out there working. Today, gentleman or lady is probably a hardware engineer or mechanical engineer that's working it. Once they go to smart meters, now there's a software component involved. What's required to train that person up to be able to do that, and what's going to be needed to make sure that that education that education part then takes place. One of the interface categories, number 22, about the security network management console and the other networks. Generally, there's a security console, and there's network routers, firewalls, computer system, network nodes. And this is more for the room, but show of hands, how many people have worked in a security in a data center with security systems? Do the network people and the security people sit anywhere next to each other? No? Yours did good. Most of the time they're across the room or they're in separate areas. So if we've got a problem, if I'm a security person, and for example, Mark is a network person, it's, hey, Mark, we might have something going on here. Let's share some data. If we remember to talk and we actually have some time and we're sharing coffee or whatever it may be. Generally, it's not an automated interface. And it's not an interface that happens naturally. It's an air gap. And again, it's force of personality instead of a process or a system put in place. So making sure in this it's something that's now needed to happen because smart grid's going to be very dynamic and very flexible, far more so than the IT side, because you're going to be shifting power back and forth. And your power information happens a lot quicker than some of the cyber information that traditionally happens. So we found the functions performed are not considered sometimes real-time activities. The security group tends to be isolated, we've talked about. The communications performed interactively, but the urgency is normally driven by critical operations, not necessarily security. I've got to make sure that this neighborhood has power, or these businesses have power, and that there's a network connection with that. It's not necessarily I have a security incident taking place. I have to have that reliability in the grid. So all of those parts have to be considered. And so we identified a whole lot of things that are flowing into the security management system. We talked a little bit earlier about this in the R&D side of really those systems don't exist where there's a seamless interface between networking and the security part where they're sharing data, especially across different organizations. So we have information that's flowing in from different geographical systems. There's sensors that are out there, not just security sensors, there's electrical sensors about what's going on in the electrical grid. There's portals back to the customers. There's customer service reps because they're taking phone calls going, why is my system down? I can't sit back and, my system's down, my refrigerator's got full of food and my food's all going to spoil, or whatever they're calling about, or I have other problems. Customer information systems coming off the internet, AMI pieces, the billing part, third party, etc., and all of those tying back into the security management system. So we identified, again, a whole series of different issues among the things looking at of resource priorities. The security view may be very different from the operational view. And for all of us who work cybersecurity, that would never happen. Always the security part is the number one view. One of the things we like to joke about a little bit is there's a huge difference between an operational system that's secure and a secure system that operates. A secure system that operates is something akin to a brick. It's very secure, and it's one means of communications, and once you use it, you don't have to worry always about someone spoofing and throwing it back at you. So very big difference in how you look at things, and with smart grid, operationally, what's the reliability and the service that you're providing to the customer is your primary view. How do you do that securely? A little bit different mindset as you're looking at things. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and before I close out for the architecture piece, I want to see if there are any other questions on the architecture. Any questions in the room at all? Because architecture was one of those parts that I know you all had some questions on.
I'll ask one.
Okay.
I'm wondering, these architecture diagrams are quite interesting. Have you gone to the next step to map particular technologies on all these points where security needs to be? I understand you don't want to prescribe, but do you have a selection or hints?
We're trying not to, as we go to prescribe, yeah, we're trying to be very careful with this because some of the, as we identify different technologies, a couple parts happen. One, there is a, if you will, a very competitive environment for different technologies. And the second part is it eliminates flexibility.
It would seem interesting to at least identify in the bottoms up and in the R&D group where on the architecture diagram these things are. I don't know if we've tried to do that.
We honestly had that debate about how in-depth do we go, and because of the slippery slope involved with it, we very much stayed away from that because it becomes a very prescriptive document at that stage of if you're going to implement, you implement it this way. And I believe I think there's still 3,000 plus players involved in smart grid, from energy providers, wireless providers, technology providers, etc. If we're describing a way to do things, very specific way to do things, then the innovation is gone. And what applies, as we talked about earlier, is what applies to a very large group may not apply to a very small group. And that becomes a problem where cost effectiveness has to be considered and a risk management piece. The risk to a small group that's a farmer's co-op with 2 turbines is dramatically different than, if you will, to a major group that has 3-4 million customers. And you really have to consider that as you go through. Now, some of the implementation guides may go into some suggestions with that, but we're trying to stay off the slippery slope. We have a question from online.
Yes, it's Ralph Makowitz.
Oh,
go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, in that general line there about the difference between a small co-op and a large utility, is there any guidance about how the risk factors are different in these organizations to give people that might be using this document some guidance, not prescription again, but just guidance about what they should be looking at?
There are 2 parts. First one, Sandia Labs created a risk management profile that's available for use for people to be able to do, so they can walk through and say, here's the steps I need to do. The second part, is the NIST. David's not here. Trying to think. There is a NIST document coming out that is 839.
39 is right.
Yeah, 839, which is a risk model, which is designed across the board to give a guideline for what are things you consider. What we are recommending right now is that for the different players to go back and work with the different governing agencies, whether it's a NERC, FERC, state, et cetera, to help develop what are the things that apply to them as they go through.
The 839 document will just identify the risks at the various levels, but not
It'll give you
necessarily.
It'll give you a model of what to use.
The 839 document is a description of an enterprise risk management framework
Hey, Mark.
that will create the concepts and process for identifying and managing those risks. It will not have any specific risk identified in it. It's a process document.
Okay.
One of the other parts that we talked about earlier was that one of the challenges DOE is trying to do is how do we share vulnerability information across the board. The unclassified, very public stuff is very easy, but there's a lot of restrictions on what can be shared and how to share it, and in some cases, privacy information or public sharing of information is actually restricted by some of the rules and regulations. So one of the tasks the DOE has across the board is how do we share that data? How do we create a system to do that? It's fairly easy from a DoD model because of the sensitive nature and the agreement for protecting certain information. It's very different in the smart grid side where you have a lot of industries that are large and small across the board and don't have access to necessarily protected information. Is there any other?
I might just also point out that the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, is pretty active in that with ICS CERT.
Yes, and that's one of the models that trying to figure out a way to tap into to be able to use.
Yep.
Okay, if there are no questions, what we're going to do is shift gears a little bit to this section on privacy, which has been one of the, from the public utility viewpoint and the consumer side, one of the ones that gets a lot of interest. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark at this stage.
Hello again, it's me. Question, is this on? Okay, cool. So we're going to be talking now about the work of the privacy subgroup, and like Alan mentioned, This has gotten a lot of attention over the past few months. And actually, when we've been doing these outreach events, this has gotten so much attention. I think the one we did at Cal Poly Pomona took up most of the afternoon session because it was a couple of guys who were there are agreeing with me. Because there's a lot of interesting issues that are brought up with this. A lot of people I don't necessarily think about it until it's put in front of their eyes. When we went to the California PUC, we actually did a whole separate day just on privacy, and we used up the whole separate day talking about these issues. So it is a big deal. One of the interesting things with privacy, especially when we're talking about the smart grid in cybersecurity, is what it's not. If you look at the architecture, you look at cryptography, you look at a lot of the other things that we've been talking about, and it follows kind of a pretty, not really mathematical equation, but you can almost say, like, if you do this, you do that, then you're secure. I know what if I do a 128-bit cryptographic algorithm, in general, I know about how secure that is. With privacy, you don't really have an equation that says 2 + 2 = privacy. You just don't have that. It's a lot more kind of loose like that. But it's still very, very interesting, and it is a very, very necessary topic in this area. And we'll get into some of the reasons why that is. Once again, if you have any questions, raise your hand, or if you're online, ask the questions, because this can get very, very interactive, and the discussions we have can be very interesting when it's interactive. At some points, I may end up being the referee up here. Just saying. So what are we going to talk about? We're basically going to talk about what the privacy group did. And first of all, I need to give the proper credit. The lead on this is Rebecca Harold, who is a privacy expert based out of Des Moines, Iowa. So what the group did, they talked about the privacy concepts. They actually spent a good amount of time defining privacy, which can get interesting. They looked at current data protection laws, and they completed a privacy impact assessment, or a PIA, for the consumer to utility. One thing, I'll talk about this later also, but I'll mention it now. They did consumer to utility because they needed to kind of narrow their focus. One of the areas that they did not do in great detail, but do want to do in the future, is talk about business to utility, because that is another area that has different privacy concerns. And they also did an analysis of privacy use cases. And as you can see, the privacy assessment in the big red circle actually feeds into the high-level security requirements. That gives you an idea in this overall process where it comes in. So the scope and the mission, want to talk about the privacy concerns and how to mitigate those. Clarify the privacy expectations. Want to identify potential privacy problems. Encourage the use of existing fair information practices. There's a lot of information practices that are out there, fair information practices, that don't need to be reinvented. So they want to make sure that those were understood, because someone who is reading this document should be able to look at that and say, this is where I need to go to look at my fair information practices. And it turns out, and utilities who are in the audience can tell me if I'm wrong on this, turns out from my experience talking to utilities that most utilities have 1 or 2 privacy officers, either someone who's looking at the privacy architecture or just looking at the fair information practices. So that would be one of the users of this document. Want to educate the stakeholders and providing recommendations for coordinating the activities of the local and federal agencies. And one of the big things is the one that's at the bottom, is promote and protect the interests of consumers and organizations. Because especially when it gets into privacy, consumers are very interested in privacy. They're very concerned about their privacy. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that all the different aspects of a consumer's privacy is taken into account. So one of the things that this does get into also is, what is private data? So one of the big discussions I had is the difference between privacy data or private data, and confidential data. So, private data is something that's your own. I'm going to probably screw up this this definition, but I'll do my best. Private data is something that is, the personal's information that they do not want to have shared. Confidential information is something that they can share, but needs to remain confidential, i.e., like a bank account number, something like that. So the group came up with the 4 dimensions of privacy, and I believe these come from a number of the fair information practices. There were a number of privacy experts in this group that spent a lot of time making sure they work together. Another plug for utilities to get involved. We would like to have you involved with this because the utilities that did get involved and the PUC members who were involved brought a very unique, I shouldn't say very unique, brought a unique perspective to this conversation that was able to bring some real-world examples to what was going on. But they have the 4 dimensions of privacy. What is personal information? It's describing the specific aspects of an individual. What is the personal privacy? It is a right to control the integrity of that personal information. Behavioral privacy, and then personal communications privacy, i.e. keeping what you say and do private. So they then got into what is the impact on privacy of the smart grid. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but in general, if you think about the smart grid, if you think about a couple of key areas, specifically when you're talking about the consumer's interaction with a smart grid, the amount of data associated with that consumer is going to increase dramatically. For example, each month I get my utility bill. I get 1 kilowatt usage hour total for the whole month. That is what the utility uses to give me my bill. I don't know how many I don't know how many kilowatts I used on a certain Sunday. I don't know how it was not broken down by 2 weeks. It's one number for the whole month. As we move forward, you're going to get, the technology is there to start giving you those readings in 15-minute increments, or day increments, 15-minute increments, even down to your usage on a 6-second increment, which means that there's a lot of data going out about you, and B, you can get a lot more information about how you're actually using your energy. So that type of data raises a lot of privacy concerns. For example, if I get my energy usage displayed or communicated on an everyday basis, you can then say, I'm using a lot of energy on a Sunday and a Monday, but not that much energy Tuesday, Wednesday through Saturday. What could that say about me? Well, that means I'm not on a normal workday schedule, which means maybe I'm working at a barber shop. So now suddenly my energy usage data has revealed a little bit more information about who I am and what I'm doing. That also means that a marketing company could come in and say, hey, this guy looks like he may be a barber. Maybe we need to give him discounts on scissors, something like that. So they can then suddenly start, if they take my energy usage data and cross-reference that with, say, my address, now suddenly I can start getting advertisements for cheap scissors. Not that I really want cheap scissors, but because I don't have enough hair for it. But anyway, that's something that can start to happen. When you go down to energy usage on an every hour basis, or it's broken down by every 15 minutes or 15 seconds, each time you refine that window, you can get more information about who the person is, what they're doing, and it actually gets to be pretty interesting. And as a marketing person, I look at that and say, that's kind of cool. I can now figure out what these people are doing and how they're doing it and what they're doing with it. And as a consumer, I go, that's kind of scary, because now someone else knows what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, and where I'm doing it. And that gets that gets very interesting. So these new technologies, they're posing new legal issues, new privacy issues, and just bring up a lot of very interesting discussions. One thing I haven't mentioned yet on here is, Alan mentioned this in the when we were talking about R&D. One of the issues that is brought up a lot is anonymization and de-anonymization. How many people know what I'm talking about when I say anonymization of data? How about de-anonymization? Okay, so for those of you on the webinar, pretty much everyone in the room knew about anonymization of data. I would say about half the room knew about de-anonymization. Basically, anonymization is taking a data set that reveals private information, stripping off any personally identifiable information. De-anonymization is a very, I think, an interesting area where you take anonymized data, multiple sets of anonymized data, and cross-reference that with, say, some publicly available information like DMV records, and recreating the fully referenced anonymized data, even and making it so that you can actually tell who the person is. So that raises some interesting challenges and some interesting discussions also. Sorry.
5 minutes more, Chris.
Okay. Okay, so I'm being told I've got about 5 minutes more on the WebEx. So I'm probably going to go a little bit quicker here, and then if there's questions in the audience here, maybe we'll keep those until after the WebEx is done. Does that sound good?
Yeah, we'll leave 5 minutes for questions on the WebEx.
Okay, just give me a high sign. Okay, so identified smart grid privacy concerns. One of them is fraud. It's can I break in and can I take someone else's identity and start making believe that I am Alan, and using a lot of energy data and having Alan pay for it. Simple one. Another one is determine what appliance is used. The closer you get, the more granular you get on the energy usage data, the more you can tell what the person's doing, and you can even tell down to the type of appliances they're using. I'll show a graph here later that will show just exactly that. From that, I mentioned you can determine personal behavior patterns. Yeah, another interesting thing is, and this is very interesting for law enforcement, is you can perform real-time surveillance. We've had a couple of interesting discussions with some law enforcement agencies where they are interested in figuring out, potentially figuring out what the person was doing, the person of interest was doing at a certain time. The classic example is grow lights for marijuana. Is someone in, if you have a high level of usage from the hours of 8 at night till 4 in the morning when everyone's supposed to be asleep and the lights were not on in the house, maybe something else was going on in that house. So that's, can create some interest. Other ones is real-time surveillance. Is there someone in the house specifically at this time? Is there reason to believe that that person may be armed and dangerous? Are they a person of interest? Do we have to worry about that? And then there's the non-grid commercial uses of data. I mentioned marketing organizations. Can I take that data, slice and dice it, and put it through some analytics software to figure out who and what that person has in the house? And can I then use that information to start sending coupons for new refrigerators or a coupon for a new oven, something like that, or flat screen TV. So this is the interesting chart. I love this chart, by the way. This was a research project that was done where they took slices of data at, I think, 6-second intervals, and they were actually able to show on that on this chart when someone in the house was actually using various pieces of various appliances. So if you see on the far left, you see where it says refrigerator. That's the refrigerator is coming on and off, just cycling through its normal cycle. But then the person wakes up in the morning, they have the kettle goes on, toaster comes on. You can even see when the oven is coming on when they're making dinner. Something like this shows that why privacy information is so interesting, because it does show that you can really see what is going on in that house. Now, one of the questions that people come up with is, well, can't you kind of see that already? Because the meters are sitting on the sides of the house already. If you go to my house, you can, stand on the street and you can take a pair of binoculars and you can see how much I'm using, or how much my house is using. But if that meter is actually covered, then you won't be able to see it. So there's questions on what is really private information, what is not private information. So once again, this privacy chapter goes through a lot of that information.
Mark, if you could go to 56, the challenges slide to wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll come back to the folks in the room for the rest of them.
So some of the challenges that we've been having is, one of them is scope. There's a huge amount of information we can cover. So the scope has been, to try to make sure we're focused and we got something out. There's a lot more, like I said, there's a lot more areas we can cover, and I'll actually get into a few of those. Another one is getting all the smart grid actors involved in the group. We need, like I said, we need utilities. We've gotten a lot of Privacy Foundation people involved, which has been very good. They brought out a lot of the use case models and things like that, but we do need to get utilities involved, and we need to get industry involved. We need to get all groups involved in talking the same language. That was actually a challenge that we had, was making sure people, when they were saying one word, everyone knew what that word meant. Representing and considering all viewpoints. This is it's not a 2 + 2 = 4 situation. So understanding where everyone's coming from has been an interesting challenge to get consensus. And then, once again, getting content that's ready to include in the publication. So they had to make a few concessions on what use cases to include and how to include those use cases. So you could see that in there. Final thing I will go through. We've gone through some of the things that are in there. The next steps that the group is going to do, they just formed 4 new sub-teams in the privacy group. One of them is going to be talking about NSTIC, which is the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. It's a national kind of research thing to look at how to do trusted identity. Looking more deeply at the third-party data access. I talked about the marketing ideas. How do you get that put together? Looking at PEVs or PHEVs, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. What kind of privacy challenges does that create? And that's a very interesting discussion. And then finally, the use cases. So with that, I went kind of quickly. Any questions online?
Okay, we'd like to thank all of our online participants. If any of you guys would like to participate in future TCIPG seminar series or other events that we have, please do go to our website at tcipg.org and reach out to us via our website, and we'll make sure to get you on the list for future events. Let's provide a round of applause for our presenters today. Ralph, go ahead. Ralph, did you have a question? Go ahead.
No.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.